And now, from the University of Chicago Institute of Politics and CNN, The Axe Files, with your host, David Axelrod.
In the pantheon of people with interesting lives, Zalmay Khalilzad would have to figure on that list. Born in Afghanistan, he became one of America's leading diplomats in Afghanistan, in Iraq, as UN ambassador at a very freighted time in our history. I had a chance to sit down with him last week at the Institute of Politics to talk about that journey and about the roiled world in which we live today. Ambassador, welcome. This is a bit of a homecoming for you here at the University of Chicago. We're here at the Institute of Politics. You spent a number of years here getting your doctorate. And one thing I wanted to mention to you is you wrote somewhere that your classmates here, having heard your story of early life in Afghanistan, calculated that it was a miracle that you had survived to that point. Why did they feel that way? Tell me about your early years.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Sure.
It's a delight to be back at the University of Chicago. This place had a profound impact on me and on my trajectory. With regard to the observation, they had looked at my friends from the University of Chicago at that time at life expectancy for an Afghan, and it was quite low in those days, and I had already exceeded the life expectancy of an average Afghan, so they called me a miracle person.
You actually lost a number of siblings growing up.
I did, because Afghanistan was very poor when I was growing up. It still is poor, but I remember with a great deal of pain still. Tears come to my eye when I think about it. When my young sister was wailing for days, she suffered, in retrospect, I judged was appendicitis, and there was no doctor. The only person that could come to see her was a person who worked in a pharmacy. Mm-hmm. And she could have lived if there had been perhaps a medical doctor, but there wasn't one, and she suffered so much. She died, of course, but the process that she went through until her death was extremely painful.
These are lessons you must have carried forward in your years in diplomacy in the State Department and so on, because these are fixable problems. There are problems that are hard to solve,
right.
But that is a problem that can be solved if you can get the resources into communities to upgrade medical care for families like yours.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Of course, when I came to America for the first time when I was 15 years old, and I saw the difference, it raised questions in my mind about why it was so different here and so difficult in Afghanistan. And was there something wrong? It raised even questions about us as Afghans at that time, as individuals. Were we less bright? Were we? And then I came to a judgment, no. When I went to classes here, in high school in California, and then it raised questions about political organization. Maybe I thought the systems made a big difference, and societies, how societies were organized, civil society, and all of that experiences impacted me when I had the great honor of representing the United States and helping places like Afghanistan to do better in terms of providing the kind of services, opportunities that exist here, at least to put them on the trajectory to a better future.
I want to ask you about that trip to America, but first I want to ask you about your parents. You wrote about your parents in your autobiography, and theirs was sort of a traditional arranged marriage.
Right.
And your mom was a child.
Right.
So really faced with these kinds of challenges, probably not well fortified to deal with the illnesses and all of the difficulties that your family faced.
Yeah. Well,
how old were your folks when they got married?
Well, my mother was 13, and my father was 6 years older than her. And my mother had her first child within a year. She had 13 children.
Oh my.
6 did not survive. Most of the 6 died before they were 5. I was, for a while, the only boy. And I have a hole in...
I see.
And that would...
let me stipulate for our podcast listeners that the ambassador has a hole in his earlobe.
Earlobe. And there was a ring put in there because they believe traditionally that by putting a ring and dedicating me to one of the saints that they believed in, I would have better prospects of living a longer life. Because 2 other boys before me that my parents had, both had died. Mm-hmm. So it was a very, very difficult situation.
You mentioned coming to the U.S. when you were 15. That was a program of the American Field Service, which was an organization that was started by volunteer ambulance drivers in World War I and World War II, on the theory that if we had exchange programs, cultural exchange programs, education exchange programs, that it would reduce the prospect of conflict.
Right.
So how did you come to be selected for that?
Well, I was a good student. I was number 1 in terms of my grade average in my class as a sophomore. And when I was a junior from the high schools in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, the top 3 students from the big high schools were candidates automatically for getting an AFS scholarship. And then one went through an interview program. There was written exams and an interview program. And I was told that I was one of those selected.
And were you, did you spoke English at the time?
Very little. I did. And part of the oral examination was to determine your English language abilities, and I had enough that they thought I could.
And you wanted to go?
I very much so. I didn't know a lot about America except what I heard on the radio and the news. That we didn't have a TV at that time. This is 1966-67 period. And about the movies, those were the 2 means by which I knew something about America.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a sense that there was something better, something different, something that could expand your horizons there?
Oh, definitely, and that also this is something glamorous, something that kind of the image of Hollywood. These movies. I was an addict of going to movie theaters. We had one in Mazar Sharif in the north, and in Kabul, several of them. And so I was very excited. I had lived most of my earlier period in the smaller town in the north of Afghanistan. Then I just come to Kabul a year earlier, and now to
And where did you go in California?
I went to a small place in San Joaquin Valley near Modesto, the Gallo wine area, called Ceres. And I lived with a great family, the Perras, and they adopted me as one of their kids. I called the mother, mom, and the father, dad, and I had two boys, brothers, that I lived with them. They had a daughter who had married by the time I made it to Ceres.
And you were there for a year.
I was there for a year.
And how did you feel going back? How did you orient yourself to returning to Afghanistan, having had that experience?
It was with mixed emotions. I had developed, strong bonds and relationships. I had a girlfriend. Normal.
The hardest part.
So here I had to go back, but I also was excited to see my parents and to tell the stories of what I had learned, what America was like, what living in Ceres was like, what going to school was like, because the schools in Afghanistan, high schools were segregated, boys and girls. A lot of things to tell my friends of my age as to what was America like. But then when I got there, I had a hard time communicating well, because half of what I would want to say came out in English, and they were teasing me about how I was showing off. But it took me a while to adjust back to the circumstances of Afghanistan.
And then you went to the American University in Beirut.
Right.
What made you decide to do that?
Well, that was also through a scholarship program, again an American scholarship program. The USAID gave in those days scholarships to students from developing countries, and they sent them to institutions closer to where they were, rather than bringing them all the way to America. And the American University of Beirut also made a huge impact on me. I learned a great deal about the Middle East that I didn't know about. Beirut is the fulcrum of various trends in the Arab world. It was a very tolerant place, open to all kinds of influences and ideas. And I became a great fan of American universities abroad.
I did a podcast like this with Steve Kerr,
yes,
who is the coach of the Golden State Warriors, and his father, Malcolm.
I knew his father, yes.
Who tragically was
killed,
assassinated when he became president of the American University in Beirut.
Absolutely. And, as I said, the impact was so great on me that when I was our ambassador to Afghanistan and Iraq, in each I used some of the resources that I had on behalf of the American people to establish an American University of Afghanistan and an American University of Iraq, where thousands are now are studying. Particularly important for young women from those countries, because parents tend to be more reluctant to send their daughters abroad.
Huge issue.
And I think now in both universities that are in Afghanistan, almost 40% of the university students at the American University are girls and young women.
I feel like I want to make this point. You, as we'll discuss in a second, became a great asset to the United States, and also in some ways to Afghanistan in the service that you provided there. But this notion of providing the opportunity for people to get an education, women, and you mentioned women in particular, which is a particular problem and challenge in that part of the world, it seems like an enormously good investment.
Oh.
It seems like we ought to make that a real priority. I feel that way about foreign aid generally, that it is a very cheap way of building bridges of understanding, of avoiding conflict in just the way that the American Field Service founders hoped when they created the program that brought you to America. And yet there's such skepticism among, you hear all the time, well, we don't want to waste money on foreign aid. That seems like the most valuable investment we could make.
Well, I completely agree that education, in particular, American-style liberal education, that, for example, the University of Chicago, as one of the great examples, offer, is extremely important. It opens the mind, critical thinking, agility in problem solving. It's great asset, opportunities for us when, as a result of education, countries prosper more, they develop. Not only it avoids, especially if they become democratic, also in the process, conflict, because democracies tend to less likely to go to war against each other, but also economic opportunities, cultural interaction opportunities. But on the development side, generally, I agree with you fundamentally, although we need to be better at, and I can say that based on my experience in two countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, where we invested a lot of, we put a lot of resources in, we need to be better at how to use those resources more effectively. Our institutions need to be reformed, how to do development better. Mm-hmm. We do great in terms of humanitarian assistance to save lives. But when it comes, how do you get a country like Afghanistan or a country like Iraq to become a free market, a thriving economy, our institutions,
and to build civil society,
and to build civil society, encourage political parties, from civil societies to parties? We're not as effective, as good as we, in my judgment, can be. And in my book, I try to offer some lessons based on my experience, because our institutions have become essentially contract managers, because we have privatized a lot of development activities, but we don't have a good theory of what needs to happen first in order for a country or a society to become successful economically, what happens second, what happens third. But we give contracts, you go build schools, we get contracts to go build clinics, not informed often by
a strategy
that is well-founded and based on a lot of data. And so I think that's where we need to take another look at, are we well organized to do development? And we must, and we should, in my view. But that's what is needed.
Yeah, I don't want to lose the thread of your story, but implicit in your answer is that we have a big investment in promoting democracy. I know that's something that you believe. We live in a time when liberal democracies are being challenged in many different ways. It feels as if authoritarian impulses are taking root. We see it in Europe. We see it elsewhere. And how concerned are you about this trend? And do you think that this is a long-term challenge?
Well, I'm very concerned, number one, and what you say is absolutely right. And it is a long-term challenge. There is the rise of nationalism, there is the rise of authoritarianism, and the mix of the two. And we, I believe, need to, again, rethink and reform our democracy promotion or support concepts, strategy, and plans. Democracy in some transition countries have underperformed. in terms of providing for security, in terms of providing for economic development while minimizing corruption. In both Iraq and Afghanistan, that I know quite well, our effort to build a democracy came in the context of a huge struggle on this in terms of the security front, and also corruption increased dramatically, because one of the instruments that we use when we go to war in the American style of war is we throw money at problems. That's one of the weapons, our weapons. And I think some people who are against democracy have used the insecurity and corruption to attack the very concept of what a democracy, for some places, in particular circumstances, are the right approach, or whether you get more security if you lived in an authoritarian society.
Yes.
And because even some of our friends in the Middle East who feared the success of democracy in Iraq, that this could be contagious and spread, they were also...
That's a dilemma, isn't it?
A significant dilemma. But I think while minimizing and reforming, minimizing the problems by rethinking how this can be done more effectively, I continue to believe that democracy among all the alternatives is the best form. That it's not easy. It takes effort. It's not going to be a straight line. There is going to be setbacks, and you need to adjust to succeed. And there are things we need to do better. I'll give you a quick example. For example, in Iraq, we spend every month, when I was ambassador, billions on military side. But we had a lot of civil society groups that we encouraged. But when it came to political parties, and elections, which we insisted on as soon as possible, the neighbors were supporting Islamist parties. You will be surprised if I told you that I didn't have a penny to support liberal democratic parties, because we used to do it at the beginning of the Cold War with European democratic parties, but then we made some mistakes. And then a law was passed that we shall not interfere in elections. And that has been interpreted that we cannot support democratic parties financially to have a level playing field to compete with others. And you have to do a finding. You've served in the White House in order to do that. And a finding has to be briefed to several members of Congress. And that immediately gets leaked. And it defeats the purpose, because the agency through which you can do that is an intelligence agency.
Yeah. These are fraught issues. I mean, we live in a time when interference in elections has become a very big
issue. We need to think that through. How do we, in helping encourage democracy, democratic political systems, bring about level playing fields for liberal Democrats, for a democratic movement, while authoritarian systems, Islamist systems, authoritarian Islamist system, would have ways to interfere. And now with the digitization of the world, kind of cyber has become also a space and instrument in this regard, as we saw in our own elections.
Of inflammation, yeah.
Right.
The other thing I wonder about is how democracy functions and competes alongside sectarianism of the sort that we've seen in the Middle East, and can commitment to democracy overcome some, these deep sectarian differences. You're a Sunni Muslim, and you're deeply attuned to the enormous hostilities in that region between Sunni and Shia in Iraq, Kurds and the Turks. I mean, those seem to trump these sort of nascent democratic impulses.
Well, for a time it does. These are phases that others have gone through. Think of of Europe during the Catholic Protestant wars, the 30 Years' Wars, that tore the European monarchies apart, and then they overcame it through an agreement on some rules, the Westphalia system, the state system that is now under challenge by sort of newly rising powers who don't have the same conception of the desirable order, is a post-Catholic Protestant war product between Catholic and Protestant monarch. So, yes, in the age of sectarianism in the Islamic world and the age of rise of ethnic politics, promoting and building a democratic order even by local Democrats face greater challenges that if those were not as powerful as they are at the present time. But history would tell us that even those can be overcome over time, that you have to persist. And I believe that I'm a strong believer, as given my own background, that no religion, no ethnic group, no race is destined not to become democratic for those reasons. And so therefore it's the kind of where you are in the evolution in terms of all the other issues, and are you being, who's being helped. Even sectarianism, while it's a force, it is being fanned as part of geopolitical rivalries.
Right.
That's an instrument
there are
that
tools,
Iran...
There are tools to fan it now, as you point out, that are much more powerful than we've seen in the past because of technology, because of social media and so on. That raises a new challenge in this. And
a new opportunity. And
yes.
We need to adjust to both. And I think we face challenges at home from these changes in technology.
Famously,
as
yes.
you say. And and technology offers digital technology opportunity for inclusive economic development, for helping millions of poor who are not part of the formal economy in the world. But yet, who owns the data? Even in those countries, how could the people who produce the data should benefit from it? Mm-hmm. These are huge issues.
Welcome
here.
to the 21st century.
Yes.
Yeah. So you were involved in when you left the University of Chicago. You taught at Columbia. You went to the State Department during the Reagan and Bush years. You were involved in two of the most hotly debated decisions of the 80s and the 2000s. So the first was to secretly arm the Mujahideen resistance to the Soviets in Afghanistan, and that became controversial because that became the roots of what would be the reactionary forces that we ended up having to contend with there. What are your reflections looking backward on that decision?
Well, I think when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, I was actually still at the University of Chicago when it happened on my way to Columbia. We, the United States, under the Carter administration and then continued under Reagan, came to a judgment that we need to confront the Soviets for this aggression. And there was an assumption at that
How
time.
did you personally feel about that, by the way?
Well,
you still have family there.
I had family there. And in fact, I began to write initially under a pseudonym in the New York Times and the Washington Post, commenting on what was going on because I had family there.
You were afraid that they would be
affected, but then we got them out. But I was obviously very much personally concerned and influenced. But we made an assumption about the future of the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan that was reasonable. And since we are at the University of Chicago, it's very important to question always your assumption. But we made an assumption that was reasonable, but turned out to be wrong. That assumption was that given the size of the Soviet Union and the size of Afghanistan, given the history of how Soviet Union used force when a neighboring state became pro-Soviet, which was that once you join the Soviet bloc, there's no way out. The Brezhnev doctrine was dominant. So we assumed that the Soviets would ultimately prevail in Afghanistan. As I said, it was reasonable, but the Soviets did not prevail. But the effect of that assumption was that we didn't think about a post-Soviet Afghanistan because we didn't think there would be a post-Soviet Afghanistan. And what we did, we assisted any and all groups who wanted to go and fight. And those who fought the hardest, we assisted the most, and those were mostly Islamist forces. Now, the lesson is...
including Osama bin Laden.
I don't know whether we directly helped.
No, but he was...
whether he was there, and we were aware of... and in fact, we encouraged even Arabs to come and fight, because Osama was not an Afghan, he was an Arab.
Right.
And we wanted to see a cost that the Soviets would pay vis-a-vis the Muslim world, the Arab world, in terms of what they were doing to their Muslim brethren in Afghanistan. But that assumption that they would prevail was at the root of it. Imagine if we had assumed that, no, the Soviets might withdraw and there could be a post-Soviet Afghanistan, maybe we would have been more selective. Now, some people have argued that regardless of the cost that we have paid, since the damage that we did to the Soviet Union, which may have contributed... That mired there and may have contributed to the destruction of the Soviet Union, maybe would have been worth it still. I am of the view that... and I argued, actually, I don't want to kind of praise my own record on this when I was there in the government. And this included some of our most brilliant Sovietologists that assumed that. And people like Zbig Brzezinski, God bless him, who said, Zal, don't waste your time about the post-Soviet Afghanistan. There would be no post-Soviet Afghanistan because of the experience of Poland and other places. That why are we assuming that the Soviets would inevitably prevail? So that's a lesson that I take away, that always question your assumptions, prepare for alternatives. Plans, when they meet reality, don't work. Others are not billiard ball, they are human beings, institutions. They can adjust, they can change. So the complexity is what I take away from that experience.
The second big decision was you were in the Bush administration during the decision to invade Iraq. I read, I did a podcast, a TV show, one of my TV shows with Condoleezza Rice, who is a friend of yours. She wrote in that book about the fact that you were working hard to try and develop relationships and build bridges between the various factions in Iraq. And you had a project going that she wanted the administration to embrace and encourage, that got stopped. I raise that as a prelude to this question. I'm not even going to ask you the big question, which was whether we should have gone in the first place. But my question is, what went wrong?
Well, if we could put aside the question of whether we should have gone in or not.
Well, now that should we have? I guess.
Well, I thought that myself, because I was at the same time that Iraq was going on, I was the president's envoy for Afghanistan.
Yes.
And the timing I was most concerned about, because I was...
You wanted the resources devoted to Afghanistan.
And I personally couldn't be as attentive to my responsibility as the president envoy with Afghanistan, as I was being constantly also asked to do things such as what you refer to as Condi, to get the Iraqis to come together on a vision for the future, should there be a change, should we invade Iraq. I do not believe that the President Bush, told the intelligence community to make up the intelligence with regard to Iraqi WMD. And 9/11 had a big effect on the attitude that if important problems are percolating, they could become even faster and become bigger, so you better deal with it in a timely manner. And Tony Blair had a huge impact on President Bush by presenting this proposition, and therefore that Iraq had to be dealt with. But putting that aside on the debate, that the fights internally we had, whether we needed to do it right then, or let's get Afghanistan in a better place, and then if Iraq has not...
That was your attitude.
That's what mine. But that the big mistake that we made in Iraq, in my view, was what we did after the invasion. We had a plan. I mean, a lot of people say there was no plan for what to do afterwards. Wrong. There was a plan. The mistake was we abandoned the plan and went in a different direction. And to this day, it's not clear why that happened, in which meeting that was decided, who was advocating for it, and where were the principals advising the president.
So just elaborate a little bit on what the two divergent paths were.
One path was that as soon as we go, as in Afghanistan, we would, based on what the work I had done, and based on my experience in putting a government together in Afghanistan after we went there, that we would do that we would put a Iraqi government, we'll keep the Iraqi army, reform it, and they will manage security, the Iraqi army, and this Iraqi government, with our help, will take responsibility. But
instead, the army was dispatched.
Yeah, the army was disbanded. We declared ourselves as the occupying power. We appoint someone from Washington to go run Iraq. And
Paul Bremer.
Paul Bremer. And he makes these decisions. And if you ask Secretary Powell, Secretary Rice, National Security Advisor at that time, and you ask the Vice President, you ask Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, with all of whom I've spoke with for my book, The Envoy, as to in what meeting was this discussed to dissolve the army, and what were the pros and cons that were being debated. No one recalls it.
That's astonishing.
I have concluded that they did not serve the country well by not having a serious multi-meetings, not one, as to deliberate on this. We had deliberated for months before with briefings that you've been in government.
Yes.
The Pentagon is one thing that it's good at, among
they
other
have a lot of meetings.
A lot of meetings, a lot of slides.
Yes.
So therefore, all of that was done, and boom, you're putting all of that aside, dissolve the army, get 500,000 people who know how to use arms. You don't even pay their salaries. They are people they have respect in their communities. They are important people, and all of a sudden, they can't support their families. They can't feed them. They've lost their position in society. And on top of that, you do it as if we were in Nazi Germany. We do a deep debatification, affecting another several 100,000 people negatively. So we create circumstances for a huge problem that
is it your sense that Bremer made these decisions on his own?
Well, that's what the president said when he was asked, President Bush, as to what happened. He said the plan was to keep the Iraqi army. Then he was asked, then what happened? He said, well, I don't know, ask Steve Hadley. I mean, that's what was his national security advisor. No, I have great respect for President Bush. He honored me with the opportunities he gave me, and he's a great American. But I think he wasn't served well by
You were the guy on the ground.
Yes.
You were the guy they sent in to commune with people on the ground.
Yeah. And I went inside Iraq before the invasion. The government put a lot of effort to get me safely in and out of Iraq, and almost like a James Bondy type of operation, that I would land at 4 a.m. In different places and meet with local leaders. And I made a commitment on behalf of the United States to these people that we will not govern you. This is not a colonial project. We have a limited interest that we're coming here for, which is we think Saddam Hussein has WMD, and we are afraid that he might use them. And then, after all these commitments, public commitments, I gave a speech to a group of them that the Wall Street Journal printed verbatim on its op-ed page, in which I said, we do not want to rule you. I said, let me repeat, we don't want to govern you. We want to facilitate for you to govern yourself. So did you feel
personally betrayed by that decision?
Oh, I was very disappointed because, and even that process of that decision, the book documents it very well, which is that Ambassador Bremer and I were both supposed to go. He was going to be a presidential envoy for making the trains run, and I was going to be the presidential envoy for getting a government organized very quickly. But then at the very last minute, again, Colin Powell called me when the decision was made that only Bremer would go.
You got run over by the trains.
By the trains, exactly right. Yes. So here is the Secretary of State. He called me, said, Zal, what deleted happened? And I said, I even joked with him. I said, Colin, you're the Secretary of State. You're calling a staffer to find out what happened. So it was that was not our finest hour. I think perhaps the war initially went too easy compared to what people expected, and there we became a little
hubris.
Mm-hmm. We can do anything.
Yeah,
and I think that diminished a sharp focus on analyzing, calculating intended consequences, unintended consequences of what you are going to do.
So what do you think when what do you see now, all these years later, as you look at Iraq, you look at Syria, how do you assess the region?
Well, the region is obviously in turmoil. It's going through one of the worst phases in its turbulent history.
If you guys had gotten that right in the first instance, would we be in a different position now?
Oh, no doubt. We would be. That doesn't mean there wouldn't be problems. But I think an Iraq that was stable, a force for good, not a zone of contestation, which it has become between the Sunni Arab world, the Shia Iran, the Turks, and then with the opportunities that contestation and that struggle, without coming to some accommodation with each other and some rules of the game, has provided ungoverned spaces and conditions in which extremism grew. And my concern right now with Iraq is that we defeated Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was a big problem when I was ambassador there. We tried to put a government of national unity together, and the extremists, the terrorists were trying to pull Iraq apart to defeat us by defeating through the politicization and taking advantage of the sectarian fault line. Mm-hmm. For that order that we wanted to Iraqis to have, not to succeed. Whether what happened after the defeat of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which we did, whether that will be repeated, which is go back to extremism, we disengage, and then the fight among ethnic groups or sectarian groups starts, and another group, ISIS is the son of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and whether we'll have the son of ISIS come back, or whether the Iraqis have learned the lesson that not to repeat the cycle that we saw before. And I'm hopeful that they've learned the lesson.
You mentioned the Turks. One thing that you've spoken about, written about, is that when you went to the American University in Beirut, you made study of Turkey and Ataturk and the kind of secular democracy that or secular administration that he developed there. We see something different now. And I'm wondering how you assess what's going on in Turkey, where there seems to be an Islamification of government,
right.
To strengthen the...
Sure. Well, in the crisis of Islamic civilization, as I call it, there is a question that Muslims in that region in particular have asked themselves, that we used to be great, we were dominant, we were successful, we were ruling parts of Europe, and now we've declined, we're not as economically successful, not as technologically, education, and so on. What happened? What went wrong, and what should be done about it? What should be done about it? The question Lenin asked, and one answer has been that you have to copy successful countries, separation of church and state, economic, free market economy, rule of law, and all the attributes of successful societies. That's one reaction, that we have to imitate the successful one. The other extreme has been, no, the reason we are not doing well is because we abandoned the true faith. That the closer we are to the Prophet's time, then we were successful. So we have to go bring back the Sharia and become more pure Islamist. And to struggle a permanent war, they believe, between the believers and the non-believers. That's kind of the alternative model. And Turkey embraced secularism, and some of the others have embraced other mixes. And now, unfortunately, in the case of Turkey, there is a resurgence of a shift towards Islam, and Ataturk's kind of legacy is being undermined by Mr. Erdogan. That's a mix of Islam and a kind of personal authoritarianism, a personal. He's a charismatic leader, great orator, is using those skills to establish a more Islamic, more authoritarian, a neo-Ottoman almost. Is not only his ambition is not limited to Turkey, for Turkey to make Turkey great again, to borrow from.
I've heard that before.
Yes, and that make Turkey great again is not only a bit of more Islam in politics, but also more Turkey in the world and the region.
What are the implications for the U.S. in that?
Huge, because I think we have swing states in our country. You've done domestic politics that matter a lot. I think we have swing states internationally too, and Turkey is, in my judgment, has been such a state. So we need to be very smart and careful, not to lose Turkey to a hostile camp, whether it's with the Iranians or with the Russians,
or a combination,
and I think we've made some mistakes in dealing with Turkey, whether it's with regard to Syria or even with regard to Iraq, with regard to the relationship. We need to hedge. We need to have a complex kind of strategy.
I mean, one of the complications is that we've been relying on the Kurds to help turn back the ISIS threat, and Turkey is obviously views this with suspicion.
Understandably in that regard, because the groups that we have been working with have been part of the PKK, which PKK has been a terrorist group. We regarded them as a terrorist group in Turkey. They've killed a lot of Turks. While the issue of Kurds in that region is one of the terrible legacy of the colonial era. I mean, these are borders that were drawn by Brits and French. I used to tease my British counterpart when Iraq and Afghanistan that our mission has become to go around the world and fix the messes you left behind for us. But we should have pushed the Turks to come up with a better option in dealing with ISIS. If the Kurds was going to be such a working with the Kurds was going to be this neuralgic or difficult for them. And when now we are where we are, we have developed a good relationship with these Kurds. Our military, especially CENTCOM, has developed kind of with the fighters a very mutually respectful and positive relationship. We've got to think about options as to how to preclude or minimize the risk of a break with Turkey, and how we. I mean, we face the same challenge with Putin. How do you, kind of in the case of Putin, avoid a war with them?
On this issue of these fraught relationships, you're an institutionalist. You were ambassador to the UN. That was the last post you held in the Bush administration. How do you assess this president's approach to national security and foreign policy, and what challenges does it pose for our allies and our adversaries around the world?
Well, I think on the positive side, I think the new president being a disruptor to raise questions, raise issues that we know have been there for a while, or their new approaches to deal with them. We know that burden sharing among allies, for example, has been a significant issue. Our European allies are not doing their fair share in terms of confronting the challenges that we face, and given our own domestic needs and the challenges that we face in Asia with the rise of China, with the change in the economic balance of power and the military balance of power there, that alone with the burden sharing the way it has been, the United States, and we cannot meet our obligations over time in those theaters. So doing more burden sharing and perhaps...
And there's value to disruption.
To that,
there's no doubt that, as you say, you're a University of Chicago man, so questioning old assumptions has its value. But disruption as a constant state...
No, as a strategy, as a tactic it's good, but as kind of a long-term strategy is not. So I was not in agreement with Mr. Trump when he was a candidate, and he asked me to introduce him to give his big foreign policy address, and I did. And one of the issues that I raised with him was that I would need an assurance that the alliances are seen as an asset at the end of the day, and that among a couple of other issues that I raised with him before doing that, and also on the condition that I could also introduce other candidates, that I would be open to doing that. But in any case, I think these alliances are extremely important. It's to our benefit, it's to the benefit of the world, but yes, some disruption. I think the balance has moved in a positive direction from the campaign time on the with regard to the alliances, and that people like McMaster and Mattis and others have had a salutary effect. If you look at the...
Although McMaster's gone now.
Yeah, he's gone.
John Bolton was your predecessor at the UN.
Yes.
What kind of impact do you think he'll have there?
I was of the view that if the president wanted a strong advocate for a point of view like John is, he's a smart guy, a great advocate, maybe he should have given him an institution to run. But because the National Security Advisor is
a broker
role, and can a strong advocate be a good broker? We'll have to see.
You spent 2 years cleaning up after him a little at the United Nations because there were some fraught relationships there. Do you see him as a conciliatory force between various competing interests?
Key role that he will have to play has to be to give the president an honest account of the views of the principals, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and others. Because there are two ways, and two options. One way is to, with a strong belief of one's own, to paper over differences and say everybody's agreeing to this point of view. But while in fact there are very significant differences, and that can get a president strategy in difficulty when the going gets tough. Or to give him honest options that your Defense Department wants this, your State Department wants that.
Knowing Bolton as you do, which path do you think he'll take?
Well, I hope he takes the second path.
I didn't ask you what you hoped. I asked you what you thought.
Well, I hope he doesn't do the paper overing of differences and use the process for advocacy. That, I think, would not serve the president well.
On the issue of Syria, as we sit here and have this conversation, the president has signaled earlier in the week on Twitter that an attack was coming. First of all, was that wise to do that? And secondly, assuming that an attack goes forward, which now seems almost inevitable, what is the likely impact of that, and how much will it further enmesh us in Syria?
Well, I think the objective, if we do something, must be to deter the use of chemical weapons against civilian population in Syria.
Well, we hit them once last year.
That wasn't enough, obviously, to do the job. So if we are to deter, it may require a much bigger effort, maybe a campaign that lasts several days to convince Bashar and his supporters that the use of chemical weapons is very risky. The dilemma is whether you can do that
without involving the Russians.
Without getting into a conflict or confrontation with the Russians. And I thought that to give the president the benefit of the doubt, that his tweet might be part of a game of chicken with Putin that says, we're coming, we're going to do this. I've thrown the steering wheel out of my car. Let's talk about, something that prevents or avoids or precludes escalation. So maybe there is some shadow boxing or actual discussion going on what would be sufficient for us to do and does not risk that escalation.
Or maybe he's thrown the steering wheel out of the car.
He has, in my judgment, by that tweet as would indicate that in a sort of what I learned at the University of Chicago is now the burden he has put by that on Putin. Mm-hmm. Would he respond or would he work for a kind of strike in which he could claim that some missiles were shot down, that he is not entirely humiliated.
You talked about your discussions with the candidate Trump about introducing him. You must have felt something about the targeting of Muslims as part of his campaign. Did you talk to him at all about that?
I did. I told him that one thing I didn't want him to do, if he wanted me to introduce him, was to attack Islam or Muslims as a category. I said I don't expect Muslims or non-Muslim necessarily to be in love with Islam. It's up to each individual and their faith, and and I have no problem attacking terrorism and extremism as huge problems of the contemporary period. I have been representing us in conflict with those forces, so I appreciate that. But you don't want to, even whatever kind of beliefs one has, but as potential president of the United States of America with global role, with a country that's very diverse, to unite over 1 billion people against the United States by attacking their faith, and I have to say that he went along, and at least in the speech he did not.
Yes. What about in his policies with the travel ban and so on? Are these things counterproductive?
Well, I think that we know that terrorists would like to use whatever way or means they can to inflict harm on us, and therefore, as a category of concerns, to make sure that terrorists do not use our immigration or our visit visa as a way to come in. I mean, during the...
Of course, but that's different than assuming that everyone who is of Muslim faith would be...
That is where I made my point with him, that a more sharply focused on terrorists and extremists is the right approach. During the Soviet period, I came here initially as a student. You had to sign documents and be vetted whether you had any communist affiliations and so forth, whether you had ever joined a communist party. I mean, something, this is well beyond my area of expertise. We're talking about immigration that is vetted with regard to terrorism or extremism relationship, that makes sense. But to say that to have a category as broad as all Muslims, that obviously would not serve the national interest and would be inconsistent with our values.
Do you think that was motivated by national security concerns, or was it motivated by politics?
Oh, well, I don't know. I don't do internal politics, so you would be a better judge on that. I thought that it was motivated by national security concerns. At least that's the impression I got. It wasn't in terms of Islam being alien to America and we don't want them here, that sort of issue. It was the issue of terrorism and extremism.
Well, Ambassador, it's great to have you here. Fascinating. The book is The Envoy from Kabul to the White House, My Journey Through a Turbulent World. A great read and such an interesting life.
Well, thank you, David. It's a great pleasure to be here at the University of Chicago. Congratulations on this great institute.
Thank you. Come back often.
And I look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Axe Files, part of the CNN Podcast Network. For more episodes of The Axe Files, visit cnn.com/podcast and subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite app. And for more programming from the University of Chicago Institute of Politics, visit politics.uchicago.edu.